afternoon, everyone. Welcome to New America. I'm Peter Bergen. I run the International Security Program here. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Smith, who's one of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the world's leading experts on jihadist propaganda and also ISIS. And he is going to give us a kind of run-through of a slide deck of some of his recent findings, and then we'll open it up for a conversation. So Mike, over to you.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. We are going to be talking about a topic that is obviously of great concern to U.S. national security managers, and hopefully I can get these slides to populate here. Is there a way to do that?
I think it should come up, yeah.
There we go. Super. As Peter mentioned, I'm Mike Smith. I'm a terrorism analyst who specializes in the influence operations of Salafi-Jihadist groups like al-Qa'ida and most recently the Islamic State. While that was an awfully nice introduction by Peter, I do want to emphasize one thing. I am not this guy, so let's lighten this up, and I hope that you all will engage. Feel free to ask questions in the middle of all of this. We're going to be talking about a pretty dynamic, really, set of issues today. And I do want to say up front that what I'm going to be trying to do with this 30 minutes is tantamount to trying to cram a ham sandwich into a shot glass. So please bear with me, and again, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll try to address them during the course of the presentation. To begin, I think it's always important to ask, what is the Islamic State? And with an audience like this, I can appreciate that there might be some hesitation to answer that question. And so with that, I also want to ask, what is the Islamic State doing with social media? So what is the Islamic State? Eric? Okay, the New York Times doesn't want to answer that. Peter, what is the Islamic State?
It's an organization, it's a movement. And what's the question exactly?
What is the Islamic State? There are no wrong answers here.
Yeah.
So, what is the Islamic State?
Self-proclaimed organization claiming to forward the most extreme orthodox ancient Islamic values.
Wow, that's almost up there with that definition for the term terrorism that a couple academics gave a couple years ago that extended for many paragraphs, but I do appreciate the input, and there's no wrong answer here, but I think in the most simplest of terms, the Islamic State is a terrorist organization, and if people want to dispute that, well, the problem with that is that they self-proclaim to be a terrorist organization. This is a montage of screenshots of the video, Kill Them Wherever You Find Them, that featured a variety of missives from participants in the Paris plot of November 2015, in which you can see one of the coordinators of the attacks notes that we are terrorists. They are the ones who terrorize those who terrorize the Muslims. So I think in a more academic context, it's important to consider that ultimately what they are is a Salafi-Jihadist organization. And with that, what you see is that faith, due to this very intensely orthopraxic ideology, is demonstrated with action and jihad. And that has been the centerpiece of the sets of narratives that the group has been pushing out using American company social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, popular file sharing sites. And in a generic sense, I'm just going to lump all that together as social media for the purpose of this. Now, I think it's important to also examine what are some key narratives up front that are part of that torrent of propaganda materials that the group has been pushing out since mid-2014 when it declared its caliphate, when it declared that it is more competent in stewarding the agenda of the larger global jihad movement than al-Qa'ida, whose chief goal is to restore a caliphal model of governance. And those narratives are that, first, of course, it has established a caliphate, as echoed in its very namesake. That is that most important claim. Next, they have restored a caliphal figure, an authoritative figure over all of Sunni Islam, according to them. Now, with that, they are demanding that allegiance be given to that authoritative figure, the caliph, Baghdadi. And that allegiance is affirmed by one of two sets of actions chiefly, either making hijra, immigrating into the group's primary areas of operation to help with defending and expanding territorial holdings in accordance with the so-called manhaj or methodology of the Salaf, the first three generations of Muslims who rapidly converted the original Islamic State into one of the largest empires in world history, spanning from West Africa to the Philippines, or, of course, of paramount concern right now for U.S. national security managers, waging jihad at home. So Since June 2014, the Islamic State has claimed credit for 6 attacks in the United States. Al-Qa'ida has claimed credit for none. So what you're seeing with all of that is that they are indeed demonstrating greater competency with respect to the push for individuals abroad, outside of the primary areas of operation, people who have not been trained in a conflict zone to execute acts of terrorism, to kill Westerners en masse if possible. So I do want to emphasize that the Islamic State does not claim credit for all attacks, even those which have explicitly been attributed to the group. What you can see here is footage of Edward Archer shooting a police officer. He later said that this was done to demonstrate his allegiance to Baghdadi, his support for the Islamic State. Now, why would he be doing that? Well, he is acting in accordance with explicit directives that have been devolved from Baghdadi's proxies and Baghdadi himself since September of 2014, when al-Adnani, the original spokesperson for the group, put out a message online, promoted on Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, etc., in which he literally calls for attacks targeting police officers, as you can see from the text here in this slide. Now, another example of influence I would submit to you that has been generated by the group is discernible from the notebook that was recovered from Rahimi after he was shot when he was pursued as a suspect for somebody who was believed to have been involved with bombings in New York and New Jersey. And what you can see here in the notebook is that he's providing deferential reference to Brother Adnani. And it's very unlikely that an al-Qa'ida enthusiast would do that, because Adnani had become one of the most outspoken, let's say, critics, to put it politely, of al-Qa'ida's senior leadership, even before the group declared its so-called caliphate. In April 2014, al-Adnani, in an address posted online, said that al-Qa'ida's leadership has deviated. They are no longer stewarding bin Laden's minhaj, and that they are no longer the base of jihad. Al-Qa'ida is no longer the base of jihad because of that deviation among the group's senior leaders. So it's very unlikely, again, that you would also see a reference to dawla, or state, coming from somebody who's an al-Qa'ida enthusiast or sympathizer, because al-Qa'ida's senior leadership and their de facto proxies, like Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, have rejected the claim that the Islamic State has declared a caliphate. So there is no dawla, according to them. So here are examples of where the group, in Dabiq, its original flagship publication used to engage with audiences, particularly here in the West, was early on appropriating the legends, the mantles of Anwar al-Awlaki, who's also mentioned in Rahimi's notebook, as well as bin Laden, of course. They claim to be stewarding bin Laden's minhaj. They claim to be the ones who have basically taken that jihad charted by bin Laden and progressed it along its natural progression towards restoring a caliphate, and increasingly executing terrorist attacks in the West. So to begin, I think it's important to take a look at how the group is using social media, of course, to help with amplifying those narratives. And what you can see here on the left of this are examples of a member of the Islamic State in an official video. He's actually from Kurdistan, referring to himself with the kunya bin Laden. Now, I was able to reach out to the bin Laden family through an intermediary and confirm that that is actually not a member of their family. And then below that, you can see screenshots of a video that the Islamic State put out early in 2016 to petition for defections from al-Shabaab. They wanted to build more support in East Africa, and they open with a clip of bin Laden discussing the importance of joining the group which is most practicing of the faith and demonstrating that practice through action. Now, what you can see here in the center is an example of one of the many Twitter accounts that was managed by Sally Jones. Her late husband, Junaid Hussein, was killed in a drone strike in Syria, and he was very much involved in the upstart of what was basically taking Anwar al-Awlaki's online recruitment and incitement program that emphasized ease of access to key narratives, as well as individual group members, to new heights. And you can see in this particular screenshot that Sally Jones is highlighting where she's been designated, especially designated global terrorist, the link to it in the Federal Register. You can also see that she's promoting a link to a sermon by al-Awlaki. On the right of this slide, you can see that last year, just after the Brussels attacks, you had a situation where Islamic State propagandists were using Twitter to promote a German language translation of one of al-Awlaki's sermons, and they were pinging journalists in Germany, directing links to it to them as a passive means of threatening people in Germany, suggesting that attacks may be coming there. Here on the left, what you can see is an example that's been one of the key concerns for national security managers, of course, which is the use of social media to network. And what you can see is Sally Jones in one of her accounts promoting an account persona that was developed by an American woman who's been charged with supporting the Islamic State, using Twitter to do that. Her persona was known as Muslima, female or woman Muslim. And what you can see here on the right is Muslima lauding one of the executors of the attacks in December 2015 in San Bernardino. So what they're doing is they're creating networks online, and they're using these technologies to build and reinforce support in fairly passive ways, but also more active ways that we're going to talk about in a moment. So here's a montage of various accounts. The one on the left here, this was managed by Junaid Hussain. And what you can see here is that he's promoting his account credentials on encrypted chatting applications or other applications that would be very difficult for investigators to track the activities, the communications they're on. You can see that he's promoting his SureSpot and his Telegram accounts. So what he's doing is he's offering direct access through an encrypted channel to people, particularly English speakers, here in the West, let's say. What you can also see up here is an example of what was called the Islamic State Hacking Division's many accounts. And this was an enterprise that Hussain, a former hacker turned terrorist, was helping to lead. Sally Jones is believed to have played a part in that. And what you can see again is that they're offering contact information on Kik and Wicker so that people could reach out to them directly from the West. What you can see on the right are excerpts of the 9th edition of Dabiq, where the Islamic State is highlighting that the two people responsible for the attack in Garland, Texas, or perhaps you might call it a failed attack, were actually engaging via Twitter, which is well known, with Junaid Hussain. And they're highlighting this in such a way as to suggest this is the sort of thing that we want to see. We want to see you pledging your allegiance very openly in conjunction with the execution of attacks, which is what you have here in this lower section of the page. So what they're doing is they're engineering perceptions of a pattern of activity which is used to demonstrate one's allegiance to the group. Now next, what you can see here is in the 3rd issue of Dabiq that was put out in the fall of 2014, very early on, they provided addresses to use to not only contact via email, but they also provided an encryption key. And a lot of people have, until recently, been pushing back on this idea that the Islamic State has been encouraging people to use these encrypted capabilities to communicate remotely around the world in very difficult ways when it comes to tracking all of those communications. Now, what's been occurring over the past year is that there's been an increased emphasis on the use of Telegram Messenger channels. It's a microblogging feature that Telegram Messenger rolled out, which you can see in this screenshot is an example of what you would call a technical support team channel that is communicating to the brothers in Belgium just after the attacks in Brussels that they need to be mindful of using VPNs, virtual private networks, which are used to mask your physical location when you're online, and to stay away from social media, because by that point there was so much work tracking the activities of the Islamic State's members and supporters in social media. And they're also encouraging use of encrypted capabilities, which should be well known to the brothers in Belgium by this point, because as we now know, there was training that was provided in Syria for people who were deployed into the West in the use of encrypted technologies, as various reporters in the room have reported on. And then what you can see here is when they started to promote all of these Telegram Messenger channels, the chief way to do that was on Twitter, and that remains a key tool used despite this crackdown. So here you have one of the bigger problems when it comes to the use of all this social media. This is an example of the list, the second major list that Islamic State's hacking division pushed out in 2015, and this was the list that was provided to Junaid Hussain and others by Ardit Farizi, who has since been charged with providing material support by gathering information about US government employees, mostly working in the national security community. That information was posted online. It included everything from their physical work locations to information about their passwords for their email accounts, their direct lines in their offices. And the way that this was pushed out again was using Twitter. It's all about ease of access. And then they can start to track people who retweet and like these tweets. And that woman who created the Muslima account, whom I mentioned earlier, that persona rather on Twitter, that's what she was charged with doing, was promoting this, engaging in terroristic threats online by promoting links to this. What you can see here is how they went about doing this. They were using what is called Cloudflare to mask where this was posted. And some hacktivists I was engaging with at the time were able to work around that and determine that this list was actually posted on a website that they had hacked into that's hosted in the United States. And there's the address for it right there. So if you were to click on this, it would not take you to that address. So this is another thing that they're doing. They're using these technologies to make it very difficult for officials to locate where something is hosted and take it down. And we'll see more of that in just a minute. Now, in this slide, obviously, this is a big issue of concern to US national security managers when the Islamic State is tweeting, literally tweeting, home addresses for people like CIA Director Brennan, DNI Clapper, Alexander. You also see up here General Flynn. Within about 5 minutes of this being tweeted, I'm on the phone with General Flynn, who's a pal, and he's saying, well, gee, Mike, that actually is my address. Thank God I moved 2 months ago. So these are very powerful tools that can be used in a variety of ways to encourage violence. And it's not just about narratives that are meant to incite violence. It's also about providing actual targets. And if we have any psychiatrists in the room, I'm sure that you could agree that that helps to increase the appeal of what they're urging, because it helps you to reconcile that this is doable when you actually have a target, not just a generic go out and kill civilians. Here's another issue that we run into with them using social media so prolifically. This was a Twitter account managed by Sally Jones, and she had taken some time away from her otherwise prolific social media activities and suddenly reemerged on Twitter and very quickly started harassing New York Times reporter Rukmini Callimachi, who covers the Islamic State and al-Qa'ida for the Times. Here you can see me tweeting screenshots of her tweets, which she subsequently deleted. I was able to capture that information before Sally removed it from her account. And this is where Sally is retweeting my tweet and also commenting on it, saying that, you know, Rukmini's relying on a male to defend her honor, basically. So that's another problem that you run into when you actually have known Islamic State members who are designated, specially designated global terrorists, harassing reporters and officials or analysts. All of that can serve to help elicit thoughts about me or Rukmini as a good target for somebody. So that's another big problem that you run into with the use of these technologies. Now, here are some more personal examples. We saw with the opening slide. 2 days before the attack in Orlando, one of the Islamic State Telegram messenger channels that I had infiltrated and was tracking all of their communications was being used to encourage people to engage in what might be considered crowdsourced threat campaigns or harassment campaigns online.
So when your wife saw that, did she try to get you to quit your job?
My wife didn't see this actually until the local press, unbeknownst to me, they wanted to interview me, and I didn't know that they were actually going to incorporate this into the story. They just wanted to talk about the Islamic State, and I was talking about threats posed by them, and the reporter broke to, and he would know, and they showed this. So it was a little bit alarming for her. But this is just one of many examples. So that day, I was getting spammed on Twitter. Here's an example of it, with images of a beheading victim with my face superimposed over it. On top of that, I was also getting spammed with clips of people having their heads lopped off. And I was also being spammed on my Telegram Messenger account, which they had figured out, I don't know how, what my credentials were on Telegram, and they were spamming me with clips of it. It was really nasty. This is more recent, and I want to highlight that although people tend to say that the use of Twitter has really declined, this is just a couple weeks ago. And so what I had done here, you can see I had tweeted a screenshot of a video that featured children executing Islamic State prisoners. And this was a very noteworthy video because it incorporates scenes of a toddler executing this unfortunate victim here. And you have an Islamic State supporter responding to my tweet by basically saying, as you can see here, this kid is from the next generation of the Khalifa men. We'll kill you one by one till the last man from you. So you see these threats constantly emerging against analysts, against reporters, and basically what they're doing is they're conveying these are ideal targets for our support base here in the West. So other ways that they've been using social media, this is just before the release of al-Adnani's final address, before he was killed. And what you can see here is that they're hashtagging al-Furqan, which is the name of one of the Islamic State official media enterprises that would be tasked with putting together these statements from al-Adnani and Baghdadi and several videos that feature key messaging from the group. And what you could see is that they were trying to get it into the top hashtags, Arabic hashtags, at which point they then released it. So they're using things like Twitter to elevate the visibility of all of this propaganda material, to drive interest towards it, to build consumers. Now, meanwhile, what they were doing, they're very vigilant on Twitter. They're putting out posters, montages like this, and here's me tweeting about what they're doing that day in advance of the release of this message. Here you can see other people, some analysts on here, reporters like Rukmini tweeting about this forthcoming message. So they're very vigilant about what all of us are doing and saying about them on social media. And meanwhile, what they were also doing is promoting photographs of notes in support of the Islamic State that were tweeted by people in places like Germany that day. And you saw just this proliferation of about a different photographs like this, people in Europe, people in the Middle East, somebody in Iran, expressing their affinities for the Islamic State and doing it in such a way as to highlight their actual physical locations. Now, with that message that was put online, his 2016 Ramadan address, we saw a progression of something that you could start to see in the narratives that are contained in Islamic State propaganda and really amplified on Twitter and now Telegram Messenger. And that shift has been away from encouraging people to immigrate into a place like Syria and to instead consider supporting the group by executing attacks at home. And in the message, he said explicitly that if the barriers to making hijrah are now too high, you should execute attacks at home. And he continued to assuage trepidations among those who would be concerned about the permissibility of mass violence, killing just anybody, which might even include Muslims in mass casualty attacks, by saying that there is no such thing as the sanctity of blood in a place like the United States. He's basically pushing as hard as he can for people who are sympathetic to the group to move to the next level, to actually involve themselves in real actions that they're calling for to affirm their allegiance to Baghdadi. So this is me a couple weeks later on Dateline, the day after the attack in Orlando. And what I'm discussing is the matter of why Mateen would have called into a 911 line or a emergency response center. Obviously, he knew that that would be recorded. Now, if you go back to October 2014, in the 4th issue of Dabiq, they're literally saying that aside from it being very important for attacks to occur in the United States and various countries in Europe and Australia, they're also saying that it is very important that the attacks be clearly attributed to the Islamic State. Here what you can see is that they're competing with al-Qa'ida for influence by way of spilling the blood of Westerners. And they literally say that it has to be attributed to the Islamic State in such a way that the Crusader media cannot confuse this as random violence. So here's an example of Mateen's 911 call when it was released, links to that recording being promoted on Islamic State-linked Telegram Messenger channels. So they've taken that call and they've used it as propaganda. They're using it to show people that this can be done, and it doesn't take much in the way of resources. Obviously, as we're going to see, it can just take a large truck or a car. Indeed, in that September 2014 address that I mentioned earlier, al-Adnani was explicitly calling for the use of cars to execute attacks if possible. He also said a boot and a rock will do, or a fist. The following day, on Islamic State-linked Telegram Messenger channels like this one, this is Khalifa News, which pushes out a lot of English language content, you saw that they were promoting a forthcoming message from a senior figure. You can see again they're hashtagging al-Furqan. And of course, later in the day, they released a message from Baghdadi. And this is how this happens. So they put out a message, and then it's pushed out onto popular file sharing sites like Cinvid. Again, it's about ease of access. And you can see that very quickly, within hours, just this one copy on Cinvid had more than 686 views, really listens, because it's just an audio file. That same day on Twitter, you'll notice that it's a very small following, only 32 followers. This account was live for probably just a couple hours. Here's somebody, an Islamic State supporter, promoting a copy of that same message from al-Baghdadi that was posted to YouTube. And within a couple hours, that single copy, and keep in mind, you could see all those links, if I go back a slide, to all these different places, Google Drive, SoundCloud, YouTube, archive.org. What you can see here is that it's been listened to over 2,800 times in the course of a couple hours. So you're achieving an international broadcast reach and consumership that is far and away far more aggressive, and the consumership, I would submit to you, probably the volume of it is far higher than what you see with al-Qa'ida and its propaganda distribution. So here's another example of a Twitter account recently being used the 30th of December 2016 to promote Islamic State propaganda. And this is the 30th of December. And notice that they're pushing out a link to a copy of an address from al-Adnani, at this point deceased, that was posted to YouTube, as we can see here, literally a month and a half prior. And it had been listened to 5,500 times. So again, this is about promoting the ease of access to all of this incitement-focused narrative. Here's another Telegram Messenger channel account that is promoting the release of the Murtad Vote, which was a flyer that al-Hayat, which is one of the official propaganda enterprises for the Islamic State, put out, in which they're calling for attacks to coincide with the election. And they're providing justification for those attacks. In there, they note that, as you can see here, the blood of Crusader voters is even more deserving of being spilled than the blood of Crusader combatants. Excuse the typo there. The same would apply to the blood of female voters. So again, they're trying to assuage trepidations of would-be terrorists about the outcomes of a mass casualty attack. Is it okay to kill other Muslims? Is it okay to kill women? So they're pushing as hard as they can with these narratives in very explicit ways and saying this is not only permissible, this is what is demanded of you to affirm your allegiance to Baghdadi. Now what you can see on this Telegram Messenger channel, this is one of the channels that's dedicated to encouraging people to continue with using Twitter to promote this type of content. And so what you have here is a message that can be easily copied and pasted. It'll fit character space-wise right into a tweet. And with it, links to some of the propaganda material. Here's a Twitter account that was used explicitly to promote that flyer. And this is on Election Day, and you can see that they're using popular hashtags, Crooked Hillary, Donald Trump, Election Day Countdown, Election 2016, to try to drive attention to this content. Now here is another interesting problem for national security managers, and that is that not only has the emphasis been increasingly on the call to wage jihad at home in propaganda that's tailored for audiences here in the West, they have increasingly incorporated what they call just terror tactics, where they provide the consumer with ideas about types of operations, not just targets, but types of operations that they can execute in order to affirm their allegiance to Baghdadi. And in this case, you see that they're encouraging the use of large trucks to execute attacks in very populated areas. And what you can see is that they're saying that an affordable weapon would be a rental truck, and an excellent target would be the Macy's Day Parade. Now, this is November 2016 that they had pushed out this edition of Rumiyah, their supplement to Dabiq. And what I want to point out here is that pursuant to all of these explicit calls for attacks and types of attacks, and pursuant to what appears to be a capacity to perhaps even accelerate the radicalization process, there's been a pretty big shift in how national security managers, especially law enforcement officials like FBI Director Comey, interpret those calls for attacks versus a year ago. Days after the Paris attacks, Director Comey issued a statement that said Islamic State propaganda is not a credible source of intelligence about what we can expect in the way of threats. Well, that was interesting because Abdelhamid Aboud, whom I showed you a montage of his comments during his missive in the video that was celebrating the attacks that had occurred in Paris. Well, 7 months earlier, he had been a feature piece in an issue of Dabiq that was highlighting his efforts to coordinate attacks in Europe. So they were very explicitly saying what their objectives were, and there are many other sets of propaganda materials in which they were calling for attacks in France, specifically in the build-up to the attacks. There was a video put out in a sheet in April 2015 where they highlighted attack plot concepts in the West to include France, Germany, the UK, and Australia, and the United States. And in that video, they said sleeper cells were waiting in Germany, and it has since come to light that they began establishing those sleeper cells in October of 2014 in Germany. So they've been giving us insights into where we can expect them to do things. They've also been demonstrating a capacity to incite violence in ways that is consistent with the types of attacks that they're calling for. And so, fortunately, FBI and other agencies went on high alert when that came out. And a couple days later, they arrested a guy, a Brooklyn resident, who was apparently expressing a desire to execute an attack in Manhattan using a large truck. So here's another example of them calling for attacks. This is in November. This is put online November 26, 2016, an official video that provides an extensive and very gruesome demonstration of how to kill people using a kitchen knife. And it's a French member providing these instructions. And in the video, he prefaces the demonstration of how to kill somebody effectively using an easy-to-acquire instrument like a kitchen knife by saying they close the door of Hijra on you, so open the door of Jihad on them. So they've progressed that narrative where al-Adnani was saying, if they have closed the door to Hijra, to now saying they have closed the door to Hijra. So they are continuing to push harder for attacks here in the West. What you can see here is that they're obviously using YouTube to promote this. Within about 2 or 3 hours of this particular copy coming out, it had been viewed 1,100 times. And it's also being put out on other YouTube posts that you can see here, SynVid. Obviously, Google Drive would be mixed in there somewhere. So 2 days later, we have an attack at Ohio State University. And it begins with the use of a car. And it concludes with the use of a kitchen knife. And what I've provided here is an excerpt of al-Adnani's September 2014 address in which he called for the use of cars for attacks. Now what you can see here are Telegram messenger channels within hours referring to Artan, who's responsible for executing this attack that the Islamic State would claim credit for, referring to him as a brother and posting images excerpted from an Ohio State University magazine that featured a short piece about his experiences as a student there. And here's the claim for attack that came the following day on a mock agency Telegram messenger channel. Now, at the time, a mock would have concurrent channels running, as you can see here, to push out, as we're going to see, claim after claim, day in and day out, dozens of claims for attacks around the world. The majority of them are occurring in Syria and Iraq, but it's this constant stream of engagement, of building the perceptibility of strength and durability, thus worthiness of support. That particular channel had a following of 3,600, and if we were to go to these others, probably many of the same people were also following these other channels. You don't get the same following that you have on Twitter because it's more difficult to identify all of this content. They send out invitation-only links that expire, so you have to really be ingrained into their networks to get a hold of all these links and to continue to track it. But again, they're using this to also concomitantly encourage people to use Twitter and other platforms that are more easy to search and find the content. They want all of this to be moved onto Twitter, Facebook, etc. So here is more recently, I mentioned to you that video that was put out this year on the 8th of January, in which they feature scenes of children executing prisoners. Now, that's nothing new. That's become a fairly common feature in some of their propaganda materials. But I think it's important to take a look at what does that mean? What they're doing is they're demonstrating for their audience here in the West that we're calling for you to execute attacks, to spill the blood of their enemies, the kuffar, in the simplest of terms. A kid can do it, so why can't you? So think about the psychological impact of this. And that's very difficult to understand and to really, I guess, qualify in terms of the impact. But when you see a kid who's capable of doing this and you're thinking that you might be willing to do the same thing, I think that right there you've just seen that, look, if a toddler can do this, why can't I do this? Next, what you see is another way that they're using videos and photos to try to incite violence. This was a video that was put out by Amok, which is basically headline news a la Islamic State. We saw one of their channels a minute ago. A majority of attacks that they claim responsibility for beyond their primary areas of operation, those claims originate on Amok, and then you have different versions of the statements that come out. But this video was put out hours before the New Year's Eve attack in Turkey, in Istanbul. And in the video, what you see are child victims of a Turkish military assault on an Islamic State position. And then what you see are other channels not only pushing out links to the video or actual copies of it, which is different with Telegram. You can put a full video on it, as opposed to Twitter, you'd have to put a link. So while you might not have the same traffic, you can actually put the full content there, and then they can proliferate it onto other file sharing sites. And you can see that they're pushing out similar screenshots to the one that I produced from the video. And what that does is that helps to encourage people to think maybe the Islamic State is doing the right thing. Maybe the West is being too aggressive. Maybe the Turks are being too aggressive. This can stimulate wills to act in very powerful ways. And you see an awful lot of imagery increasingly in recent months in Amok's videos highlighting the results of Russian airstrikes, of American airstrikes, and they incorporate children who have been killed or injured. Sometimes they're in the hospitals receiving medical treatment. This can have a very powerful effect. This can perhaps have a bigger effect than just saying, this is the enemy, go kill them, and here's how you can do it. Now, another way that they've been using things like Telegram Messenger and Twitter to promote ease of access to their content is by also using standalone websites. This was one of Amok's websites, and here you can see where they've posted the video that was produced by the person responsible for the attack in Germany, in Würzburg last year. They would push this out with English subtitles in this particular case, so that people here in the United States, people in Britain, can easily consume this. And what you can also see here is evidence of the importance of social media to the organization. So on the English language Amok agency website, you have all of these options, things that you can click on, Tumblr, LinkedIn, Pinterest, Google+, Twitter, Facebook, Telegram, to promote links to that video. It's that easy. Just hit the button and get it out there so other people can see it. And in the process of that, on Twitter in particular or Facebook, recruiters can see you posting it. And maybe when they see that, they'll want to come looking and knocking on your door and figuring out if you're really willing to do something more than just post messaging on the internet. So here is an interesting way that they are also increasing the ease of access by technology development of their own. What you can see here is on the Arabic language website, and these are suspended every other day, and then they pop up a new one. You have them promoting an add-on or plug-in for Firefox browser for Amok. You add it to your browser, you click the button, and it auto-directs you to Amok agency's Arabic language websites. Whenever they're suspended, the next one comes up, and it works great. It works a lot better than the Android app that they developed, and they've developed several versions of this app because of glitches with it, where you can plug in this app to an Android phone and get constant pings of Amok's reports throughout the day. Everything from destroying a tank in Mosul to a suicide operation in Baghdad. And what you can see here is one of very few dubious claims issued in that torrent of claims of responsibility for attacks from Amok, where they're saying that they assassinated an American officer in the Turkish city of Adana. I say it's dubious because the Department of Defense has denied that claim. I take them at their word for it. But again, this is about ease of access, and they're even developing their own technologies to streamline it, to rely less on social media platforms. Here what you can see is me thinking 2 or 3 days ago, why don't I see that Firefox add-on for the English language website that they've been increasingly promoting, where you can find English language versions of their official propaganda, which is often originally published or produced in Arabic or other languages. And then I'm thinking as I'm putting together this presentation, it would be reasonable to anticipate that because they're promoting this Halumu site more and more. And sure enough, as I'm putting together the presentation, they roll out a Firefox add-on for it. So here is an example of what you find on Halumu. You can see these drop-down tabs, translations of speeches by Baghdadi, al-Adnani, one of which I referenced earlier. This is about ease of access to content that you can post links to, you can download it, you can post the full content on your own website, you can pass it along around among your friends. Here's an example of how they're using Just Paste It to push out a daily report. And again, this is about engagement. Al-Qa'ida does not put out daily reports on their operations across the larger area where they claim to have control of territory or be stewarding their jihad. And you get this from the Islamic State, and you get it in many different languages. And this is one of a daily example of links to the English language version of that. And again, they're using popular file sharing sites to push this out. Here's an example of what's very difficult to, again, qualify the impacts of, I guess, other than to say that the group has managed to stimulate the will to act more prolifically than al-Qa'ida has since it declared its caliphate. This is the Amaq agency infographic pushed out via Telegram on one of its channels that highlighted the group executed more than 1,100 suicide attacks in Syria and Iraq last year. So what it's doing here is it's presenting the perception of a group that is more dedicated to the cause than perhaps al-Qa'ida and others that are still competing with it that have yet to join the group. And what you can see here is an example of a weekly infographic, the English language version of it, for attacks executed by the Islamic State during the Battle of Mosul. And what you can see in this case, they're claiming 17 suicide attacks during this week. You can see that they're presenting you with information about vehicles seized, destroyed, disabled. They get very specific in all of this. They want to build that perception of strength and, again, durability in the face of better equipped, technologically superior adversaries. Now, here are several slides that I'm going to go through to give you an idea of postings on an Amaq agency English language channel. And again, this is all about demonstrating just how strong the group is. What you can see here, 2 Humvees destroyed in Mosul, an Iraqi forces tank and BMP destroyed, a martyrdom operation on the outskirts, basically, of Mosul. Al-Bab, 3 Syrian opposition militants killed. Keep going down. This is just the first post on the 15th of January. This is just some of it, to give you an idea. I mean, claim after claim for attacks, and then what you have here are things like a parked car bomb is detonated against a gathering of Shiites in Baghdad. You know, an attack, the Islamic State fighters are advancing in Deir ez-Zor. And then you have these images that are incorporated into it and these specific reports about operations in Deir ez-Zor, these sit reps. And then you have these videos that come out that highlight the successes in their battles. And these are very short videos that just give you some clips. And so people will say, well, there's been a slowdown in Islamic State propaganda production. And what they're talking about are these lengthier 40-minute videos that will provide footage of multiple battles. And you'll have key figures like Turki al-Ben Ali providing statements about the importance of supporting the Islamic State and waging jihad and executing attacks, or demonstrations of how to kill people with a knife. But you still have this steady torrent of these short videos from Amaq. And then on top of that, you have unofficial Islamic State propaganda that's pushed out by the likes of Asawardi media. And all of this is, again, used to build and reinforce support, to build that perception of strength and durability. So you can see a tank that's been destroyed. You can see a fighter. These are just screenshots of the videos as they're playing. You know, more going on. That's one of the enemy combatants they've killed. Then you can see in this, same day, this is just within a few minutes, just the amount of stuff that they push out. Here's a scene of a suicide attack, a dual suicide bombing in Mosul. So you see this, and you see it blowing up in the distance. Here's the other car. They have these, basically, they rig these mobile fortresses. So you try to stop this with basic artillery, that can be pretty difficult. And they'll drive them into their enemies' positions and detonate them. You can see it blowing up in the distance. And then you have a sit rep here for some fighting that's going on in northern Sinai. They've been steadily claiming credit for killing Egyptian military forces over the past year in the Sinai. You don't hear a lot of reporting about that. You don't hear a lot of reporting about their attacks in Somalia, for instance, like this one, in Mogadishu, where they've increasingly been conducting terrorist attacks. And so Asawari Media, which I mentioned earlier, this is a screenshot of one of their Twitter accounts in 2015, 14,000 plus followers. This would have taken about a day for them to amass 14,000 plus followers on Twitter at that point in time. Asawari Media, this is this past week, a couple days ago, this is their 41st Telegram Messenger channel. And within an hour, they've got 1,000 followers on it. Even though it's more difficult to find your way onto these channels in Telegram, they still are able to build that support base, that consumership base. So early in 2016, Twitter acknowledged that there was a pretty big problem when they, in a blog post, advised that they had closed 125,000 accounts, mostly linked to the Islamic State. And a couple months later, the Wall Street Journal ran a story that highlighted some of my work tracking this activity. And in it, they provided screenshots of some engagements between me and two Islamic State propagandists, in which I'm asking, does the suspension do anything to deter you from continuing to exploit these technologies? And here are the actual tweets and correspondence. They simplified it, but basically what they're saying is no. If anything, it makes them look better. Indeed, they are touting as credentials the number of times that their accounts have been closed. In this case, this is the 431st account. A couple months later, Twitter acknowledges that it's closed 235,000 accounts. So what I would submit to you is that we have to start looking at questions such as what is it that can be done to more effectively deter the exploitations of these technologies. Through all of this constant engagement, through this torrent of propaganda materials, that passive engagement to the actual real active engagement, the identification of prospective recruits and the interactions with them openly on Twitter, or the provision of account credentials for encrypted chatting applications openly on Twitter and Facebook, what can be done to deter all of that? And that's something that Peter and I are going to talk about. Any questions before we get going about those slides? Yes?
As the Communist Party of the United States declined, it's felt that more and more of its members were FBI agents or informers or so on.
Uh-huh.
When it says followers on these various sites, what percentage of them do you think are people like yourself, and what percentage are...
That's a very important question. When you went back to 2015 and you would see a following for an Islamic State Twitter account that sometimes would have 40,000 followers, I would submit that oftentimes it may have even been the case that they were creating accounts that were used to simply follow key accounts and build the perception of this being popular. But again, that's very important because they are enhancing the perceptibility of legitimacy with all that activity. They're looking popular. They're looking like they're liked. And if you're an 18-year-old, you know, in the sticks somewhere in North Carolina who doesn't have much in the way of relationships, maybe this looks like a place where you can start to establish relationships in the cyber domain.
Is it possible, I'm sort of a digital illiterate, when someone registers as a follower, is it possible to identify who they are?
Well, there are ways that policies could be implemented at social media companies to do that better. But what we're going to also discuss are policies that revolve around examining the tools, such as virtual private networks, that the Islamic State encourages its support base to use to mask their physical locations. Twitter doesn't want to implement a policy, apparently, that would prevent somebody from creating a Twitter account using a VPN and going out and issuing terroristic threats, to include pushing out the home address for the incoming national security advisor, for instance. Twitter also doesn't want to implement a policy where somebody could find it more difficult to go online and say that there's a terrorist attack that's just been executed in downtown Manhattan, mask their physical location, and sit back and laugh as people panic and emergency responders try to figure out where that's occurring. So there are some policies, and we'll talk briefly about that in just a minute.
Okay, so we have half an hour, so I want to be sort of pretty efficient about questions and answers, but I'm just sort of going to start with some quick questions from Mike. So what is, you've explained the problem very well. What is the US government doing about it? What are social media companies doing about it? What should they be doing about it? And we have a new Trump administration coming in. What should the Trump administration be doing about it? And to what extent has ISIS addressed the new administration in terms of their, because it's strangely absent, I thought, from your presentation, is what their view of the new president might be.
Well, let me start with the first question. What is the US government doing about it? Well, I think that if we were to look back, what you could see for a period of years is that it's first to start by noting that this was not unforeseen. In 2004, Assistant Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz advised in congressional testimony concerning the importance of denying terrorist sanctuaries, the potential of terrorists developing what he called cyber sanctuaries, which basically we've seen al-Qa'ida and the Islamic State do on Twitter, until recently, that is. So this also, obviously, this phenomenon began before the Islamic State was, declaring its caliphate. And what it did was it looked around clearly, its recruiters, and identified spaces of the internet where al-Qa'ida was particularly active and began competing for influence in those spaces, Twitter notably being one of them. At the time, it declared its caliphate. As-Sahab, which is the top most important media enterprise for senior al-Qa'ida figures, had a following on its Twitter account, I think, of more than 20,000. So that was naturally something that you wanted to compete with, that influence in pushing out the content they're in and engaging with people. So, first of all, I think that when you look back at the history of that, the emphasis clearly was on collection versus disruption. Watching all of this activity on social media, using that activity to identify bad actors, maybe paths for engagement of those bad actors, preventing recruitment from occurring, preventing attacks from occurring. But what you've now seen with the Islamic State is something different, where again there's perhaps a capacity to accelerate the radicalization process, culminating in a resort to violence. So what you have increasingly seen is that the government has, in very open ways, albeit passively, highlighting that Twitter, for example, is a preferred platform when it comes to the Islamic State's dissemination of propaganda and the use of Twitter to engage with people, particularly here in the West, who might be willing to execute terrorist attacks. And the annual calendar that NCTC puts out for counterterrorism, last year they noted what I just said, to paraphrase them. You've also had Director Comey in congressional testimony highlighting the problems that come into play when we see the exploitations of social media technologies such as Twitter's or Facebook's. So that's all passive engagement towards the private sector. Now there are, of course, private engagements, quiet engagements that go on. Just today I was meeting with some National Security Council officials talking about this very issue. And there are ongoing discussions, and these companies are aware of the problem. They're aware of the potential of some very serious legal problems that come from this. But in many respects, the laws, the way that they exist today, effectively indemnify these companies from class action lawsuits by victims of terrorist attacks, say in Orlando, et cetera. So, there's the engagement, and I don't want to get into too much about that, Peter, and walk around your question too much. But there's with the volume of attacks executed in the West by individuals not trained in a conflict zone by the Islamic State, who are executing attacks to affirm their allegiance to al-Baghdadi, when you see that, you can reasonably presume that oftentimes the initial interaction with them, the consumption of their propaganda, the way that they're beginning to build this perception of the group as being worthy of their support, a lot of that's going to revolve around the group's activities in the cyber domain. So that's, that reach into the West that you hear officials talking about. I would submit that there needs to be more demonstration of what I would call corporate responsibility on the parts of various social media companies.
These lawsuits which are brewing, I mean, there's some, you mentioned Orlando, but there's also, I believe, a number of Israeli families are also suing.
Sure, and it's not just the Islamic State, it's not just al-Qa'ida. You have Hamas has a very active incitement program on Facebook.
But the question is, what is, there's nothing like getting the attention of a corporation than a lawsuit which might have some success, or be a sort of a reputational cost if it went to trial.
Sure.
So what's your assessment of these lawsuits? Because this seems like, obviously, the social media companies tend to be immature, relatively speaking. They're relatively new companies. They tend not to have a government a policy shop initially because they just don't. So how is that going to impact this?
Well, I think that my sense, and I'm not a legal scholar, is that most of these companies, again, the way that the laws are designed in their favor right now, they're effectively indemnified just by the U.S. Code of Law right now.
What about lawsuits outside the United States?
Well, I'm not sure. Again, I'm not a legal scholar, but I do think that it poses PR problems for these companies, most of which are publicly traded, and that can serve to influence decisions about policies that could be developed and implemented to more effectively deter this type of activity, this exploitation of their technologies.
So what should the Trump administration do that the Obama administration has not?
Well, I think that there are some ways that perhaps the current legal framework which exists could be amended in such a way as to encourage various companies such as Twitter, Facebook, Google to implement policies, or frankly, for that matter, to literally require them to, that would more effectively deter a lot of this exploitation of their technologies. Short of that, they could simply go to the FCC. Well, short of that, they could simply go to the FCC and say, look, we have a national security issue. And what we see is that the Islamic State in particular is the centerpiece of that issue right now. Now, again, there are other groups that are exploiting these technologies, but what they're encouraging people to do are, again, to use things like VPNs to mask their locations. So the FCC could say to the social media industry, for a period of X years, you need to either only allow verified account users to access their accounts when VPNs and other such technologies are being used to access the accounts, or do things like charge a monthly fee that will increase the risk, basically, for these groups when it comes to their members or their supporters using these technologies, because it will increase the capacity of an investigator to more rapidly identify their physical locations.
What's the argument the social media companies would use against that?
Well, obviously this gets into privacy concerns, and that's a very elaborate discussion. I'm not sure that we have time to cover it all right now.
But you've suggested something that actually could work, which wouldn't run into a First Amendment problem, which is that if people are, as I understood it, if people are posting on these sites, they have to have some sort of verified VPN that verifies that they are them, so that there is some kind of transparency about who's using these sites. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that right now, if you use Tor browser, specialized browsers that can help to mask your physical location, or you use a virtual private network to access Twitter, and you go there and you scream, there's a terrorist attack occurring in New York, it's basically a situation where you could walk in as a ghost into the theater, scream fire, and laugh as people trample all over themselves, because nobody will be able to identify where that came from. And that's the scenario that you have on Twitter or Facebook right now. And you do see that in the case of Telegram, they've been taking measures to increase the risk. It used to be the case that you could create a Telegram messenger channel, use that, or account, and then create channels using a VoIP number, in other words, just a digital number. Now you actually have to use a dedicated cell phone or landline, a real phone number to do that. So in theory, that will increase the risk of exploiting those technologies.
How would you assess how Telegram has been doing, since much of your discussion was about Telegram?
Right. Well, Telegram clearly is the preferred vehicle for pushing out all of this content, and for also, what I didn't highlight, creating chat rooms that are invitation-only chat rooms where people gather, much as they would openly on Twitter, to express their enthusiasms for the Islamic State, to call for attacks, express their misgivings about Western influence. I think that, again, when you see them implementing policies such as that you must have a real cell phone number, not just a burner phone number, to create a actual account, and then from there create your channels or your chat rooms, they're actually trying to take measures. What you also see is a very high rate of suspension of key Arabic language accounts. That suggests to me that some of these groups in the Mideast, particularly in Saudi Arabia, that are tracking a lot of this activity, are presenting these invitation links to Telegram, and they're being very quick to suspend these channels and the account managers.
So it sounds like Telegram is doing a much better job than it was even 6 months ago or a year ago.
Yeah, it certainly has been the case. In the foreign policy report that I highlighted a screenshot of, I noted that by June of 2016, even Twitter was clearly doing more to more rapidly suspend clusters of accounts that were linking together and posting out hashtags that are typically associated with Islamic State propaganda. So they've even progressively done a better job of trying to limit the accessibility. The problem with Twitter in particular is that the real recruiters are not going to be out there pushing out these hashtags. They're going to be watching for the accounts that might be retweeting or liking or commenting about this stuff in an open domain that's easily searchable, and then they're going to start to engage with those people.
How would you assess the veracity of ISIS claims for an attack? So, because I mean, we often have claims, but you also interestingly said, they didn't claim the Edward Archer attack in Philadelphia. So when you see a claim coming up, how kosher is it in your view?
And I would say they've probably got somewhere around a 97 to 98% accuracy rate on that. Now, in terms of claims in the West, in most cases, when there's not even a video that's put together by the executor or executors of those attacks, what authorities eventually do determine or discern is that there has been engagement with suspected Islamic State members or supporters who are involved in networks in Europe. And so even short of the video production that a mock will brand and post online, there's oftentimes evidence of engagement that's occurring beforehand.
Why wouldn't they have claimed the Edward Archer attack? Because he had mental problems? Because he had no what's the thought process when they? You also mentioned Rahimi. They didn't claim the New Jersey attack, right, in your presentation?
Well, I think that maybe one safe assumption is that in those cases, those individuals didn't really have any engagement to speak of that. And some people have surmised that, well, they've survived, and so they could recant in some way. Or it could simply be that they don't want to encourage authorities to dig deeper, to work harder in some way on examining these people's networks, because there might be others who are planning similar attacks. There's so many different ways that you can look at that picture of issues, Peter, but I do think that they're very careful, and it boils down to the issue of credibility. They certainly don't want to claim credit for an attack that's executed in the West, and then 2 days later, al-Qa'ida pushes out a video in which the terrorist affirms that it was meant to demonstrate solidarity with al-Qa'ida. So they're very careful about their brand equity and management of that brand equity.
So it's very rare for them to claim something that's untrue.
I would say it's very rare, yes.
Okay, questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, identify yourself, and we'll start with the gentleman in back there.
My name is Laurent Martelemi. I'm a reporter for Agency France Press, news agency. The US military have said that they have started to use cyber weapons against ISIL, but we don't know very well what are those cyber weapons. Do you have any hints of their efficiency? Do you have signals that these cyber weapons might be used against all this activity that you're describing?
I think, as the gentleman seated in front of you would agree, the best way for me to address that question is to say I am unaware of any such activities.
This gentleman here.
Thank you. I was wondering, to what extent
Can you identify yourself?
Yes, Aaron Zucker. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. To what extent have you seen ISIS rhetoric and online strategy changing as it's been losing territory?
I'm not sure that I would attribute much change there, but again, as I mentioned, there's been a steady shift in terms of the narratives concerned with action items that are meant to affirm your allegiance to Baghdadi, the so-called caliph. In terms of their engagements with people here in the West in particular over the past year and a half, there's been the increasing emphasis on the waging jihad at home as the most important thing that you can do. And I do think that it is a matter of pragmatism. you can see that even when they promote that in an issue of Dabiq that they've succeeded in attracting recruits from Trinidad and Tobago, weeks later a group I think of 9 people from Trinidad and Tobago were picked up in Turkey as they were apparently trying to travel into Syria to join the group. And so there has been an increase in the barriers to access, if you will, into the primary areas of operation in the Levant. But of course, what I'm not seeing that's interested me quite a bit is that they're not really calling for people to make hijrah into the other areas that they claim to be governing. So the group has claimed to have established, as of July of this past year, 35 provinces or wilayat. And 16 of those are located beyond Iraq and Syria, and we're talking about places as far away as the Sinai Peninsula, obviously, Libya, Tunisia, Somalia, the Caucasus, and the Philippines. And so you're not really hearing a lot of calls for people to travel there, which is suggestive that means for the people there to be involved in, developing notions of stakeholdership by joining the group and building out these provinces that they claim to be developing and governing in these spaces. And they're less interested in seeing people from the West go there to support all of that. They want them to be waging jihad in the West.
Paint a picture for us of, you mentioned Amaq, you mentioned Khalifa News, you painted Furqan, all these different sort of news agencies and propaganda outputs. Now, presumably they're not all in the same newsroom amenable to being bombed. So how does it actually work to the extent that you can make a case?
Well, what you see, according to a video that was put out in July of last year that highlights the structure of the caliphate, and some of the slides incorporated into the video, they provide a glimpse of the structure of their larger media enterprise and all these different brands that are associated with it. And so you have the key brands like Al-Furqan that puts out the messages from the senior most leadership. Then you have al-Hayat that puts out publications like Dabiq and more recently Rumiyah and flyers like the one that I mentioned. Then you have a weekly publication, Al-Naba, which is produced in Arabic. And then you end up with English language versions of that are pushed out in Rumiyah and other just pages online of it, English versions of some of the infographics therein. Then what you also have are media enterprises for each wilayat or province. So what they want to have is this perception that they have bona fide media enterprises the way that a state government might have a media arm here in the United States. I'm not sure that it all is produced by the same people, but the production quality of many of the videos suggest as much. Either that or they've developed basically a graphics designer warehouse somewhere where people are working together to develop these things. You can imagine a production unit, and then they send that into other places where people who are competent with the various easy-to-use video production programs that you can buy online can incorporate all of that graphic design work in with the footage. So it would probably be a problem to assume that it's all happening in one building and that it would be as easy as that, because this is all very important to the group in terms of building that perceptibility of strength and durability, resiliency, and with that worthiness of support. You don't want to lose that talent pool with one strike. You want to have that spread out so that the production of all of this continues despite the loss of people involved.
And what is your explanation? You mentioned we're not seeing these 40-minute highly produced videos anymore.
No, you are actually. I mean, they've continued to push those out.
I think you said they had gone down.
Well, I mean, there's been a slight decline in that, but at the same time, you nevertheless have the continued production of these short clips of battle scenes that provide near real-time updates in some cases of attacks that are being executed in places like Mosul during the battle for Mosul. So I'm not really sure whether or not that in any way diminishes their influence capacity.
Barbara Mohammed recently participated in the P2P program. The P2P program, are you familiar with that?
Not terribly.
Let me just say, this is the opposite propaganda. We're supported by Homeland Security and the State Department. I work with Maya Satora at the University of Hawaii, and the program was addressed at 160 colleges in which we were supposed to produce media to counter the message. At UH, if you want to look online, Facebook, hashtag Ride the Wave UHM, and we came in third. I don't know how they evaluated the program, and I really don't think that it probably works because it's probably not visited by the people who would be.
Better you say that than me.
Okay, so what's the question?
Is there, in your opinion, a way to do counter, like we would post something like the letter the 4-year-old wrote to Obama that said, "I'll take the Syrian brother into my house." Is there any use for us psychologists to waste our time with counter propaganda?
I think that it's important to explore anything that can be done to limit the influence capacity of a group like the Islamic State or al-Qa'ida or other elements comprising the global jihad movement and other terrorist groups, especially those that are particularly active on the internet. The measurement of efficacy of those activities, that's always, as you know, going to be difficult. I believe the Counterterrorism Center at West Point recently put out something that highlighted that there's not a lot of matchup in terms of the people who are attracted to the propaganda that we're concerned about and their interest in this other stuff. So obviously that is suggestive of some deficiencies. I don't want to speak too harshly about that. I have openly expressed concerns about the absence of metrics for measuring efficacy of the programs that are funded by the Global Engagement Center.
But isn't that always going to be the case? I mean, outcomes that don't happen can't be measured.
Well, Peter, that's a fair point. But I suspect that some of the people involved with managing those programs really don't have backgrounds in marketing sufficient to understand how to roll out a counter-influence operation.
This gentleman over here. We have 8 minutes left, so we need to be...
Hello, Adam Kaplan with USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. There's been a fair amount written about the fact that online inducement is not a sufficient, probably a sufficient cause for people to join and go hijra and go to the Middle East. We've seen this around that often. There's a personal connection required for people to make that leap. First, do you agree with that? And second, are you seeing that change in terms of the online recruitment tools that are presently available? And is the nature of the action presently, if it's not hijra, if it's something more local, does that change the dynamic about what might be a reasonable inducement tact?
Yeah, well, historically, it's clear that in the case of al-Qa'ida in particular, you would have this potential of generating appeal sufficient for people to travel into conflict zones and try to make contact at that point. But there were also obviously cases where there were networks of people tasked, either they were tasked or they were just passively, volunteering to try to build support for the group and encourage people to do things in the West. With the Islamic State, as I've highlighted, you had various instances where Junaid Hussain, for instance, would remotely engage with people here in the United States or in Europe, or his cohorts would, and use social media as the vehicle for that relationship building that you're talking about, that engagement. So just because they're not here to physically interact, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that the impact of the interaction is any less impactful. And, I would just say that what you're also seeing with the Islamic State, unlike al-Qa'ida, is they want everybody to join it. Al-Qa'ida has historically turned away everybody but the best, brightest, most capable candidates for participation in their jihad. And with the Islamic State, you're also seeing a repeated volume of push for attacks in the West, both passively and actively. In the case of the active incitement that Junaid Hussain would be involved with, that you just don't see that volume of engagement with al-Qa'ida. So it presents a larger set of potential problems and impact with that. I mean, just the engagement rate being so much higher, both active and passive. But it's a fair point that historically there's a lot of interaction that is involved with inducing people's support for these organizations. I just think that the Islamic State has managed to supplement an absence of physical networks in some cases with all of that online engagement.
This gentleman here, and then the gentleman there. We have 5 minutes left, so let's make it tight.
Hi there, Nick Gorsey, the Heritage Foundation. Just wanted to ask in terms of social media usage and recruitment, in terms of these marginalized, I focused on homegrown recruitment in my thesis, and I found that the like button played a role of instant validation. Do you mind touching on that at all?
I I don't want to get too much into that. What I'm more concerned about is not just the instant validation where somebody is developing a notion of participation in a program, of promoting these things, but also the problems that come into play with respect to all of that activity is very visible. So if you've got a recruiter, say, in London who's watching a teenage girl, ostensibly a teenage girl, expressing affinities for posts that are put out there promoting Islamic State narratives or even actual propaganda, that person, as we have seen, can use something like Twitter direct message to identify them and then begin to engage with them and measure the extent to which they may be supportive and try to build more support towards, again, that resort to action to affirm allegiance as it's called for.
Gentleman here.
Hi, Paul Hanley from AFP. Two things, if I can slip them in. First, is such an action with the FCC, would that be so sweeping that it would deny activists who we want to support in countries from using VPNs and VoIPs? Would that be kind of dangerous you couldn't separate the targets?
I'm unaware of Twitter having received export permits from the State Department to support political revolutionary activism, as an immediate counterpoint to that. Now, I do recognize that there are some implications there in terms of the use of social media to organize in ways that help to promote American values, among others, in various parts of the world. But at the same time, I think that we have to, my perspective on it is consider the national security implications of the absence of these policies.
Your second question?
You mentioned, I think you mentioned that when they start up, when ISIS wants to put out things that they, and their channels have been shut down, they start up something, they push it out to potential viewers or things, which sounds like they have a mailing list. And if that's true, isn't it easy to shut down their mailing list?
No, it's not a mailing list. When you're using something like Twitter with these hashtags, that's an easily searchable platform. So you push out a video with certain hashtags that are common, such as a hashtag of Amok, for instance, or al-Furqan, or al-Hayat, or Khalafa, or Khalafa-en for English language versions of this stuff. People who are enthusiastic about consuming this stuff and wanting to find it and learn more about it, potential sympathizers, prospective recruits, they're able to search this out on Twitter and Facebook and other similar sites. And so
Okay, I misunderstood the way you put it.
no, what I was talking about is using something like Telegram Messenger, which can be hard to actually access these networks they're in for your average person because it's not as easily searchable as Twitter or Facebook. They'll post the material there or links to it, and they'll encourage that it be disseminated in more easy to access environments.
We have 2 minutes left, so we're going to take 2 questions together and a very brief answer. This gentleman and this lady.
Emerson Brooking, Council on Foreign Relations.
Hey, Emerson.
Hey, Mike. About a year and a half ago, we had the opportunity to discuss the efforts of anti-ISIS online activists.
Yep.
There seemed to be 3 lines of effort back then: serving as a content moderation force, hacking, outward-facing ISIS distribution nodes, and then serving as kind of a crowdsourced intelligence platform. I'm wondering, a year and a half on, as your own efforts have continued, where do you think these anti-ISIS activists could be most effective? And has that opinion changed?
Okay, let's table that for a second, and then you ask your question, and then we're done.
Thanks. I'm Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. Say, in addition to a lot of the counter techniques, what about dealing with the underlying grievances, sense of humiliation, moral outrage, that are the more causal driving the appeal of the
And you have to
recruiters?
wrap this up in about 90 seconds.
Emerson, I think the most impactful work that some of the so-called hacktivists have engaged in when they've done it in a way that's carefully coordinated so there's awareness among officials at various agencies is infiltrating these networks to build trust sufficient for a would-be recruiter or supporter to share information that can be used to prevent recruitment activities or perhaps even an attack from occurring, or even after an attack where they're willing to share that they had foreknowledge of an attack in some way, and perhaps that person could be used to identify a larger network that might be involved in trying to execute add-on attacks. But that it is, at least in 2015 through mid-2016, the presence of Islamic State supporters and propagandists on Twitter, for instance, was so vast that there was a need for more butts in the seats in terms of the engagement to try to ferret out some of this potentially actionable intelligence. And that's where I think is most important, because most of these people don't have training in counter messaging sufficient to understand how to autonomously develop and roll out, an effective CVE program of their own. Now, to your question about the narratives and countering all of that in order to limit the influence capacity of groups part of the global jihad movement, as we would call it, it's important to keep in mind that most of these narratives, they're not new. I mean,
I wasn't asking that. I said that the actual grievances.
That might actually be a good point.
Well,
That's almost like another conversation,
Yeah.
which is a huge discussion. But since we're over time, I want to thank Mike for a brilliant presentation. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.